what I will be presenting today is mainly looking at ports infrastructure in the Horn of Africa, especially in light of numerous investments that have been undergoing to this region, especially by China, the UAE, and others, including previously the US, the UK, and the region of East of Africa, or the Horn of Africa in particular, has been more or less a site for competition, and not just a recent competition. It has been a site of competition during colonial powers, and nowadays we've seen another sort of interest and attention that is going to this region. But when we look at the infrastructure and the investment around port and transport infrastructure in particular, the majority of the literature has been focusing on the materiality of infrastructure, how they are being reproduced through certain projects, how colonial infrastructure have been more or less revived and reproduced in the East of Africa. But more importantly now, what we see and what we've done a little bit of research on is looking at how these infrastructural developments, they don't really exist in a material world, but they also generate ideas, identities, and they intermingle with the societies where these infrastructural investments take place. So when we look at logistics companies like DP World, that's the example that I'm going to use today, among other logistics companies, they definitely have a project to containerize trade in regions where basically there hasn't been containerization before. Most importantly in Africa, but in East Africa in particular. And somehow these kind of projects for development, they're not really void of certain pre-existing ideas and model that evolved elsewhere. So in a way, in our project, we examine how these narratives of development around infrastructure, around ports, around transports in East Africa, how they are coming with certain ideas, certain models, but also how local actors have agency, how they receive those ideas, how they develop them in different contexts. So more importantly, I'm looking at somehow like this sort of like channel that exists, or the cities that exist linking the Gulf of Aden, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, and the Mediterranean. And on this sea route in particular, there are several cities which are considered of high strategic importance, as we've seen lately during the Gaza war, how this trade route in particular has strategic importance for international trade in general. Estimates of that say that around 30% of global trade is actually going through that sort of sea route. But also we've seen how international investors throughout the years and the decades have been competing over port and city modernization in the Horn of Africa, but also in the Red Sea, in an effort to actually be present on this waterway. And this through containerization, standardization of trade, but also opening new markets, especially in Africa, especially where there's still potential for modernization, there's still potential for increasing containerized trades. But investments are not just in ports, and we see usually projects coming in sort of like mass investment that aims to modernize ports, but it also comes along with modernizing corridors that could link the ports to cities or to other countries, airports, roads, railways, etc. And often the East of Africa is usually targeting the largest market in the region, which is currently Ethiopia. So in a way, these questions of infrastructural boom that we're seeing in East Africa, but more importantly in the Horn of Africa, are somehow subject to different stories and different narratives. And what we've tried to do in this particular piece is really look at these narratives, look at these stories, trying to understand how these stories come with infrastructural development, how infrastructure, which are material, physical artifacts, they can have lives of their own and they can actually drive identity formation, but they can also drive narratives, either in certain cities or in certain countries. So here I'm going to be mainly focusing on the two cases of Berbera and Djibouti. Djibouti, which is the capital of Djibouti, and Berbera, which is the port city in Somaliland. And I will talk more about this, but before moving on, I would like to talk a little bit about the theoretical framework, what we're trying to do in particular to understand how these narratives emerged. So when we went on the field, the first few visits, we were having these kind of assumptions that it's all about geopolitical competition. It's all about controlling the waterway. And people will be opposing all of these infrastructural developments because they come in new forms of colonialism or new forms of domination, and rather would subject people and cities to external power. But when we went in the field, we were kind of struck and surprised by the positive and some sort of like optimistic views that we've heard from everyone that we spoke to, that this is for our future, this is the best for our development, that we're aspiring for this, that it will modernize the country, will modernize Djibouti, it will make Djibouti like Dubai or like Singapore. And the same thing in Berbera, where people were talking about, okay, this is our main way for Somaliland to get recognized internationally. And then we started thinking that somehow these narratives are not just about an optimism towards the future, but it's also about how people define their country, how they understand their country, and how infrastructural projects around ports are rather driving some sort of a national narrative about the role of Djibouti in the region, or the role of Somaliland in the region, its place, its relationship with its neighbors and others in general. So in a way, we started looking at these narratives more thoroughly. We interviewed people from across different sectors, people working in the ports, people somehow living in the cities, city inhabitants, truck drivers, politicians, elites, but also just normal people, to get a sense of these kind of narratives and how they travel across societies. But in general, somehow we found that these kind of identities are not just related to who they are, who this sort of like national narrative is about, but it's also related to experiences of the past, but also a vision for the future. It's always about understanding where this experience come from, about a certain past, about telling the story of the past, but also about telling a story about the future. But at the same time, people, they were very much looking at the past, not only their own past, but also models, other models that existed elsewhere, successful models of development, and looking at these as some sort of spaces of experience. So in Djibouti, people talked about Singapore, talked about Dubai, talked about later on another Chinese city, Sheku, as somehow this is our future, is going to look like these examples, like these kind of cities. So we found that one of the interesting theoretical framework is Koselleck theory of historical times, how through his theory he's linking the past and the future, which in his account are both anthropological givens, where somehow they meet in the present. And that's where the narrative of the present is actually telling the story of that experience, but also building expectations about the future. So in a way, in our cases, we found that the spaces of experience, they're not necessarily spaces that were given, but they're spaces that existed elsewhere. And that's the term that we use, that they're experiences of elsewhere. So in a way, people, when they're building the stories of where these infrastructural experiences came from, they rely on other experience that existed in other countries, in other cities. But at the same time, these models, they're not just coming and being imposed on local actors. Local actors digest these kind of models, digest these spaces of experience of elsewhere, and they start weaving it into their own history, into their own narrative. They find a place for it in their own history, but also in their vision for the future. And that's where we found that these narratives usually construct elements of distinctiveness and elements of difference. They're saying, oh, we would like to be like Dubai or like Singapore, but we're different. We have our own model. Yes, we're going to benefit from their experience, but still Djibouti is different. Djibouti is unique in its own way. So in a way, we found that these narratives of being similar is there because the whole process of modernization and development around ports, around containerization is built on this idea of standardization, standardizing transport, making all the processes look similar everywhere, having this capitalist flow of goods, of finance, and even of knowledge is the same everywhere, but at the same time, each actor or each city starts to build their own story, that they're still different. They have something unique and something distinctive to offer compared to these spaces of experience. So to illustrate that dilemma and this contention that we found, we compared the cases of Djibouti and the cases of Berbera. And again, we've conducted interviews, and the interviews gave us a lot of background, and it was very clear, these kind of narratives, and we tried to show these narratives in each case. So looking at the first case of Djibouti, Djibouti is a very small state in the Horn of Africa that basically emerged out of French colonialism in the continent. And somewhat the identity of Djiboutians have been a constant struggle for independence against France and independence against colonialism, but its geostrategic location was used by the regime over the years and the decades the modernization and the process of developing the port of Djibouti started in the early 2000s when the Emirati company DP World decided to invest to modernize the port of Djibouti. And some of these photos, you will see the photo on the left, on my left is, it's a Red Sea World Museum that I will talk a little bit, that tells the story of Djibouti, the story of development, of modernization. And the second photo, it's a railway that connects the port to Ethiopia. And that was considered like Djibouti as the gateway to the Ethiopian market. And most, around 80 to 90% of trade that basically goes to Ethiopia through the sea passes by Djibouti ports. So in the early 2000s, DP World started investing in developing the port of Djibouti. And to an extent, the story here started as a case, as a potential case of turning Djibouti into Dubai of the African continent and emulating the Dubai model on Djibouti soil. And that came, of course, with modernizing the port, building a container terminal, a free zone, a railway, and also shopping malls, hotels, modernizing the city itself after that model. And of course, again, for a very long time, Djiboutians sort of identified themselves as they will be the Dubai of Africa. They have something here that's it's going to make Dubai a modern country, a modern city that looks exactly like Dubai. But at the same time, over time, Djiboutians realize, well, but we're still different. We have a unique sort of character here that we are not just going to be a Dubai, but we're going to be the gateway. We have something different. We are here the entry to the African continent. We would like to become like a transport hub for the African continent. And this was very clear in our interviews and in the stories that people that tell about themselves, about Djibouti, about their own understanding of their place in the continent. After 2017, there was a fallout with DP World where President Omar Guelleh basically revoked the concession agreement with DP World, and they were kicked out immediate effect. And then they went on with these kind of legal cases over time where DP World actually won one of these international legal cases. But at the same time, President Guelleh didn't really waste too much time. He received an immediate offer from the Chinese company, China Merchant Group, or CMG, that took over to modernize another port in Djibouti, and this time to modernize it after the model of the city of Shekou, that was also a successful case in the Chinese context. And then they built this Red Sea Exhibition Center where they basically told about the story of Djibouti. This is going to be a Chinese sort model that will be applied to Djibouti, the Chinese model of Shekou. But at the same time, Djiboutians seemed increasingly uncomfortable in adopting these kind of examples without adding their own character on it. So they say, well, yes, we would like to be like Shekou, but at the same time, we're not going to be 100%. We will have to find something or a model Djibouti that we will present in our own way. Of course, it's still unclear what is this different model, but at the same time, here, this idea of having Djibouti as a crossroad, as a hub, as a point, as a nod for the African continent seems one of the strongest sort of narratives that are used to show that Djibouti has something, a different model to offer. Again, with a lot of optimism, a lot of aspirations about the future, a lot of imagination and imaginary of what the future might look like, development, prosperity, more jobs, more economic opportunities for the people and the residents of the city of Djibouti. Berbera, however, is a different case. It's rather a city that evolved in over time. It was a very ancient port, but it was modernized and it was heavily used during the British Empire in the 19th century, and then taken after that by the Russians. And it was the hub for the livestock export from the east of Africa to the Arabian Peninsula for a very long time. After several decades, the port was run down, especially after the civil war in Somalia. And with the independence of Somaliland in the early 90s, the port again became a source of contention between the government and the clans. And for a very long time, the port was left unmodernized, completely neglected. And you can see that most of here, like the photo on the left, most of the machines were very manual, basically trade through dhows, and somewhat it was just a very traditional port in every aspect of the way. After DP World was kicked out of Djibouti, they started looking for alternative location, alternative ports to invest still on the same waterway that would lead up to the Red Sea. The first candidate that came up was Berbera. Hence, there was a concession agreement that was signed where DP World basically invests in rebuilding and modernizing the port of Berbera, and also a corridor that would link Berbera to Ethiopia and other parts of Somaliland, with an airport that's currently being built, and again, after the model Dubai. So again, here we listen to people in Berbera talking about how they would like to become the Dubai of East Africa, or the Dubai of the Horn. Again, very similar to how Djiboutians perceive the same sort of opportunity. And at the same time, here, people in Berbera were not necessarily highlighting this distinctiveness or how they're different, but they're rather using this as a main driver for their national project, for being recognized. Again, Somaliland is not a state that is only recognized by a few, including Taiwan. So it's not really a recognized state, but they've been working towards this recognition for a very long time. And everyone sees that this port opportunity, or the port modernization by DP World, is the opening sort of opportunity for other investments to come in, for having financial recognition and eventually having state recognition of their own. So here they don't really highlight distinctiveness as much as they highlight their aspirations for the future. They highlight how the model of Dubai actually presents some sort of a vision, or again, an imaginary for how they envision the future of Somaliland. And again, we can see here how many sort of national sort of characteristics are given to the port. And we've heard people talk about how the port is the heart of Somaliland. It's the artery of the country, and it's the most important resource, and so on. So in a way here, we see how this national identity is becoming more and more connected to this aspiration of the future, connected to port modernization and containerization. So just to keep up with the time, I will conclude, but at the same time, during the Q&A, I would welcome any questions about the details of these actual cases, and I'm happy to go through more details. But we've seen here that port modernization in particular has created or driven some change in narratives, changes in the stories of how people tell the story of their country, or tell the story of their past, and also their aspirations for the future. So in a way, many of these international investments are coming with standardization, homogenization of making these kind of spaces look pretty much like successful models that existed elsewhere through this capitalist logic. But at the same time, we find that African actors are embracing this model, but they're also reworking a version of their history. They're embracing the spaces of experience from elsewhere, but they're actually taking an ownership of the story, and they're telling their own story and their own aspirations of the future. So this kind of scramble for infrastructural that we're seeing at the moment in East Africa in particular is rather a source of hope, aspiration for development, modernity, and prosperity for many people, but it's also driving a whole new narrative of how these countries develop their own story around infrastructural development in general. And more important, that we've seen that decades ago, or during previous waves of infrastructural development, they were more connected to colonial projects. At the moment, we have global South actors like the UAE or other global South countries that have investments in Africa or in East Africa, alongside China, of course. They come in with different sort of models, but they also have their own ideas of how development should look like in these countries, which is very different from the Western previous colonial wave of infrastructural development that we've seen before. But in a way, these kind of interactions and models are triggering different understanding of how we see the scramble around infrastructural development, especially around ports infrastructure. And it's also telling us how this expansion of capitalism, the expansion of infrastructural development, it might be intended in a certain way at the beginning, but once it's reaching different contexts, it has a life of its own. It creates independent narratives, it creates independent stories that might not have been intended by the initial investment at the beginning. I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. Just one final comment. Again, this is part of a larger project that has been now concluded, but we have several block pieces on different aspects of the project. And we also have several forthcoming publications, including this one.